Hi, Kate.
Hi, Natalie. So
Welcome
good to
back.
be here.
Yeah,
Yeah, thank you.
this is your second visit on our podcast, and I'm excited because the first one, well, first of all, you're our second visitor.
Oh, I'm so honored.
Yes. And secondly, it's an opportunity to dive into some topics in coaching that we know our community of coaches struggle with at the beginning of their journey in certification. So um, maybe you could take a moment just to, share with the audience your role in our community, and then we can, dive into some conversation.
Yes, yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, I'm a returning guest. I feel very honored. So I have been part of this community since 2020
Mm,
and started off as a learning leader, facilitator in the life and wellness program. And I work in the area of mentorship and just really just so grateful for the the community and the connection that I get to have in this space and in the learning space, holding space for learning, holding space for mentorship. Yeah, so
yeah, it's
that's
just been
what
such
I do around here.
it
Yeah.
goes so fast, doesn't it? This like I
Oh,
can't believe you're in your fourth year. And I mean, I just want to say you don't just work in the area of mentorship. You lead our entire mentoring division, like from all,
okay.
managing and not managing, but like because I don't really feel like our coaches need management,
Yeah.
like our facilitation team or our mentor team doesn't need management, but you oversee, you give such great guidance. You're their go-to person. You've organized all the systems so that the coaches in our community have a seamless experience from one mentor to the next. You keep us on our toes and you keep us
Uh,
organized. So yeah, you do a lot for the mentorship.
thank
And as a facilitator, you have really made, I don't know if it's a niche, but it certainly is a specialization in life and
you.
wellness coaching, I think in our community at least. I know you have, a broader business, but in our community, I think you're certainly um, the the expert in the life and wellness realm of our programs. And I appreciate all the work that you've done to become that in our community. And so that's why it's so exciting to have you here to talk about, some of the things that you hear as a facilitator, that I hear as a facilitator, and even in the mentorship, like people are struggling with a few things when it comes to starting their practice as a coach. So what are some of those things that you're hearing?
Yeah, well, I think even just getting started, like
Mm,
having that first coaching session with someone else, coaching for the first time and coaching for the first 10 times. Like the um I that kind of that term, the ripping off the band-aid of getting started and how that can feel like such a huge hurdle.
mhm.
We learn so much around creating connection, cultivating a space of trust and safety, those kind of foundational pieces to a coaching conversation. And I think sometimes that can feel like, I want to say like maybe a lot of pressure that, I've got to do all this before I coach and I'm learning how to do those pieces. So how do you do both? Right.
Well, and I think a little bit of what you're touching on is that imposter syndrome that people feel when they are either, you know, so passionate about something that they do it naturally. Like I feel like I've struggled with imposter syndrome in the sense that I'm um, constantly checking in with myself, like, is this, am I really, you know, skilled enough? Am I knowledgeable enough? Have I done the due diligence and really worked my craft to deserve to sit in front of people as their coach? Very successful people, worldly people, high level people, even just people that are, anybody in my practice. I often wonder, the privilege of sitting in front of someone as a coach kind of triggers that imposter syndrome. And so I've seen it also in our clients, in our coaching, clients or people in certification. And so what you're talking about is that a little bit of that, plus, being new at something. Being new is hard, right? It's uncomfortable. Change is hard. So it's certainly something I've seen too.
Yeah. Yeah. And isn't that interesting too? Because what you're naming right now is so incredibly common, right? Like, I'm not an expert yet at coaching. So therefore, am I ready to sit beside my client or sit across from my client or be with my client? And yet, like, isn't that the paradox, like, of coaching, is that we aren't the expert,
Right.
right?
You're not meant to be the expert.
We're not meant to be the expert. So it's funny how that actually can work for us if we don't get hooked by that need to, what is it, like certainty? Like, is it a need for certainty, or like
I think it's a desire to, for me, I'll speak for myself. It's a desire to feel prepared for any situation.
right.
And, the amount of hours I've coached, between coaching, mentorship, facilitation, program development, over 40,000 hours is an easy number for me to come up with in the last 10 years, more so. And then the education. And I still feel that, what if there's a situation I'm unprepared for? But what you just said about not being the expert, that's where I shine. Like, that's where I know I am, all the work I've done to be the so-called expert actually is what gives me the confidence to let go and to
Right.
not be the expert, right? So I hope that when I think about the program development in our community and all we do to support our coaches, what I hope the most is that they feel so confident with the framework and the knowledge that they've gained that they will eventually feel confident to let go and to let the process run itself, knowing that they've been well educated and well informed. And so this idea, it's an interesting paradox, right? we're skilling up and increasing our knowledge and working hard to complete the certification, only to let go.
Yeah. Yeah. So that brings me to how often, when coaches are starting out, okay, they've learned the model and now they're off to begin practice, how that we've beautifully created this framework and questions that go along with that framework that serve as a guide to get them started. Right? So we've got this lovely list of questions that, if nothing else, and I'm sure you have too, I've heard many questions where you can hear the coach just, they got their cheat sheet and they're just going through questions. And how powerful that can be alone, right? So it's like, it's almost like this beautiful safety net as you're learning the arc of a coaching conversation, how these questions kind of unfold before you start to have that skill to start to come up with them organically yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something that is, I think it needs to be said that that's a natural process in learning. When you have, we call it focusing more on performance than on the outcomes you're after. So as a coach, I hope to support people through change, to evoke awareness, to create new perspectives, new possibilities so that they can create new outcomes for themselves. That's my ultimate outcome. But at first, when I'm learning this skill, I have to first focus on my performance, which is the skills I'm learning to get the outcome I want. And so what new coaches end up experiencing is that they're learning how to become better listeners and ask intuitive questions. Yet that's really hard when you're focused on your own performance. Where am I in the model? Am I doing this right? What question did I just ask? Which one am I going to ask next? Did I just lead the client? Did I just give advice? All of these things are going through our minds. And so I guess, what we're talking about is this natural progression from having a safety net with the questions we provide and some structure and a framework, that eventually the more you do it, the more comfortable you get. And I think it's the necessary process to get to the place where you can do it without the net. Right. And to be okay with that. That is the process of change and growth.
Yeah. 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 And also that positioning yourself as a learner, which I feel is a beautiful parallel to positioning yourself as a coach.
Yes.
Right? We can position ourselves as a learner, then we can allow ourselves kind of that room for experimentation, for intuition, for even making mistakes in the coaching space. And it's very much in alignment with positioning ourselves as coach, because along with that comes curiosity. Oh, what happens if I ask this question? Or, oh, what happens, how we can get feedback from our, in this particular case, we want to work with peers, because that can be a much richer learning environment, before we're working with people that don't understand coaching and that arc of a coaching conversation. So kind of how can we position ourselves as a learner in that environment? And how does that then position us to be coaches and maintain that sense of curiosity?
I think it's such an interesting and brilliant sort of position to think about, because I think one of the things that we do as humans is we jump into that what I want, and that what am I trying to say? That this difficulty that we sometimes have with instant gratification, right? So I join a certification, I start week 1, and I want to be a coach week 1. I come in going, I can do this, I got this, I want to be a coach week 1. Well, the program is 28 weeks because it's time that you need to learn to become a great coach, right? And so I think what you're saying, positioning yourself as a learner, is such an important, even though it seems obvious, it's not. It's so important to say, I am going to humble myself in a way that I can stay open to learn and unlearn this material, and my previous patterns, right? Unlearn my previous patterns, learn new material, be open-minded, mind like water. I think that's the best, flow, ebb and flow to allow this new learning in, right?
Yeah. 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 So in thinking about that, what advice would you give someone who is coming out of the week where they have learned the model and they're going into okay, we say now go coach, because next week we're going to debrief your first coaching session.
Yeah.
What do you want them to know?
Well, first thing that comes to mind is the self-care agreements that we offer, right? Self-care is just having a plan for the moment you feel unworthy, because we all have that moment, right? We're sitting in front of a coaching client or a peer coaching opportunity, and we're nervous, and we might freeze, or we might not know what to say next, or those moments. It's important to have a plan for self-care, to know that you're absolutely in a very normal, process of learning, and that self-care agreement is going to help you through those moments so that you're not discouraged and you return to your motivation and your, your goal to achieve certification. So yeah, because we see that a lot of people are nervous and scared, and now suddenly they have the framework and they're meant to do this, to actually go and do it. And that's a moment of reality for a lot of people, like, oh, I'm not just learning in books, I'm actually going to be having conversations. So I think that would be number one. And then number two is dive in. There's no learning without doing in coaching. We can't learn from theory. We've got to practice, because being in conversation is how we learn to pivot as coaches. We learn to trust our instincts. We learn to lean into the other person's experience, and we learn to self-manage our own experiences, right? So in the doing is the only way to learn those things. So I would say dive in and self-care.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So part of that self-care is like, when you say that, like I can kind of go macro and micro in that sense of, yeah. So what kind of things am I doing to prepare for a coaching session? The self-care before, after, and just my practices in my day-to-day life that support me in cultivating a sense of presence and compassion and all those wonderful things. So I kind of go macro, and then kind of like on that micro level is like, okay, so what's my plan if I start to freak out, or if I have that kind of imposter syndrome? Like, who are my people? Who can I reach out to? My facilitator, a mentor, a colleague, a peer? Like, what are my list of people that I can go to and say, hey, I just had a coaching session and it didn't feel good, or it felt great, or, so I kind of think all of that is so important as we're on this journey.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Having, things you're doing for yourself, and then people you can rely on to support you. Relationships are so important, I think, when we're learning something new, that to have that support from the people that your entourage is important. And one other thing that's coming to mind, which I know you talk a lot about, Cate, is this idea of do no harm.
Mm.
And that part of the fear, I think, of new coaches starting to coach is, what if I don't do this right? What if I harm someone in my approach? And yeah, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, for sure. So one thing I find in this idea of do no harm is, we're well positioned as coaches, first of all. If we're not giving advice I feel like we're already in a great position,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
To provide a space that does no harm. Now, I also feel like practices open-ended questions. So if we are practicing open-ended questions, I'm always telling new coaches, take your time. There's no rush. So when you are formulating a question, sometimes I find what happens is that the question is being formulated as we're talking.
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of coming up with my question, and then I'm actually just going to rephrase it, and then I'm going to do this other thing. And so it can get confusing for the coachee to try to make sense of what's being asked of them. Do I answer all these questions? Do I answer the last one? And so I feel like, how can we give ourselves permission to just take our time and come up with an open-ended question? Because that, again, leaves so much room for the coachee to go wherever they want to go. And so that is helpful in this idea of doing no harm. So we're asking those close-ended questions, and how they can start to very quickly become directive, right? So that's one thing that comes up for me. And then also I find there is an element of getting a good understanding of coaching. So if you're coming into the program and you haven't experienced coaching, so maybe that's a good time to start being coached. So there's so many people in our community that are building their hours and looking for some peer coaching, that you can start by getting coached for a few hours before you start coaching, which will help you have that experience. And I think that's one, and I may have said this before, but one of my favorite things when I came into coach training is that there's no other training that I have ever done that they're like, no, you must be a coachee. Like, you must be the receiver of this service. I've never had that before. Personal training. I was never required to be a client of a personal trainer. That blows my mind. I hope things have changed. So having that experience of being in the place of coachee teaches us so much. So I feel like that also helps in that idea of doing no harm, when we get a good experience of how we want someone to feel in that seat of coachee by experiencing it ourselves. So those are just a few things.
I wonder if we take that for granted, because I'm wondering, I'm sitting here thinking, how many professions or professional development realms do that, where whatever skill you're learning, you must also be the client of that skill.
Yeah.
And I think it's a great learning model, because what we hear from coaches in training, but also from our own practice, I'm sure you could say the same as I could. Every time I am coached, I learned so much about myself as a coach. I learned so much about what I want, what I like, what I don't like, what I'm noticing is comfortable or uncomfortable, or thought-provoking or not thought-provoking, how safety is created. All these things you learn so much by sitting in that being coached, sitting in that coachee chair.
Yeah.
And to me, I think also what do no harm is, it's first of all a commitment to the mindset of coaching. If you come into coaching thinking it's advice, thinking that you're consulting, or that you'd like to be a mentor, those are different helping professions. They're not coaching. So when people truly step into the mindset of a coach, they are willing to, get curious versus have the answers, right? And therefore, the leading and advice is not supposed to be a trap unless you're not embracing the mindset, right? So I think work on mindset first, understanding what the coaching mindset is, and then self-reflecting and observation, and doing some hard work, which is the practice of stepping out of that mindset. I remember I had this one student years ago. He was 72 years old, believe it or not. He was coming to and I say that, and that actually sounds young at the perspective that I have right now. I'm like, oh, I'm getting older. So 72 is midlife, right? But at the time, it was like he's 72 years old. He had done his career and still working as a contractor, actually. And he worked the entire, I think at the time it was 25 weeks of our program, to reframe his closed-ended questions to open-ended questions. It was something that he had never learned. He is a high-level executive, and in a leadership role, in a very command and tell type of role, because that was standard, leadership style. And he saw the value in the open-ended question, and he had to work to unlearn what he had learned over his entire career. And that commitment was how we do no harm, right? The commitment to open-ended inquiry, the commitment to self-observe and recognize where our strengths are and where we want to improve. And also a commitment to be open to feedback, because isn't that a brilliant gift in coaching, is when we get feedback?
Yeah. Yeah. I was thinking the exact same thing. And I feel like it's like a full circle moment right now to like that position yourself as learner, how it ties to doing no harm and being able to receive feedback. So, I feel like when we encourage our students to start coaching in practice, they are doing it with peers. So what a beautiful opportunity to open yourself up to some feedback. Like maybe that can be an agreement as you move into working with each other that, how would you like to receive feedback? Are you open to feedback? What does that look like? And I also feel like that ties into perhaps setting an intentions. So how we talk about intentions and how powerful they are. And when we know what we want, the how reveals itself. So if in this particular session, I want to work on goal setting, can I just state that as my intention? Just put that out there that I'm going to work on setting the goal. Love your feedback after and how you feel we did that. And then move into the coaching session and then potentially give space after the session or maybe reconnect after the meeting to debrief. How did that go? Right. And again, it requires us to be vulnerable and really position ourselves as learner and open ourselves up to what we might not know about ourselves, both our strengths and our opportunities for growth. And that is what will help us ensure that we are continuing to grow, like you said, coaching mindset and doing no harm as we continue to practice and potentially move outside our peers and start coaching people out there in the world. Yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing I'm thinking of right now is maybe we can end on this one is the discovery calls and what is our obligation to the client and to ourselves as practicing coaches in a discovery call. And by discovery call, I mean the call that you have with the client that is the introduction to your engagement potentially. It's kind of a meeting of the minds, see if this relationship will be a good one, a good fit, and also an opportunity to talk about what coaching is and isn't, what the contracting might look like, and so forth. So what do you think is the responsibility of a new coach in a discovery call?
Mm. Well, first, I feel like playing with that with a peer is really important, right? Because then you get to start to experiment with that. And I feel like as a new coach, yeah, being able, like you said, to communicate what coaching is and isn't, and getting really curious about what the potential coachee hopes to gain from the coaching relationship. So I find that can tell us a lot, right? And so again, the do no harm, like if I can really get a good sense of what my coachee is hoping to gain by working with me, then that will help weed out if it's consulting they're looking for, if it's more a therapeutic approach they're looking for, if it's any of those things. So you can really be clear in your contracting and in agreements with your client that this is what I have to offer. And I think also with new clients, a new coach with new clients, can you give room for feedback? Can you make that part of your agreement that, I'll check in on what's working and what's not working. And I hope that we can be really open with each other around that, because remember, this is a partnership, right? This is a partnership. We're thinking partners. And that, I feel like that could be a great approach for new coaches.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is really important. Starting with peer coaching and practicing those discovery calls together. It's always, better to be in the community of other learners when you're practicing something for the first time than it is to try it with a potential client for the first time, of course. So I think that that's an advantage that coaches in our community, must take advantage of to honor the client that they will have eventually, and then this bringing feedback into the engagement as part of the engagement. At week 3, let's have a 15-minute call and check in on feedback, right? How's it going? How much progress do you feel you're making? What do you want to shift? Where do you want to, what are your thoughts on how, where you'd like to take this engagement? And then again, maybe at 8 weeks, depending on how long your engagement is overall, because that is what we do in the corporate space when we're coaching. We embed feedback into the process. We ask the question at the very beginning of the engagement, what is success? What has to happen for this engagement to be successful?
Yeah.
Looking back 4 months from today, what has to happen? And we ask that question, of course, to new coaches coming into our classes every time, right? We want to know, what do you need for this to be a successful experience? So we should also be asking that of our clients in order to give us a better perspective of what their expectations are. Because ultimately, when we use curiosity, which is, the biggest, I think, tool in coaching, the best tool in coaching is your curiosity. When we use that curiosity to know the client, to discover what is important to the client, we're that much more powerful as coaches we're better positioned to deliver a great service, right? So it's using that curiosity in the contracting phase of coaching as well.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what, I'm conscious of time and thinking about having, really enjoyed this conversation and thank you so much for taking your time again. What would you say is sort of a last, message to coaches who are struggling with a little bit of imposter syndrome, a little bit of, uncertainty in those first weeks of learning to become a coach?
Yes. Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is that compassion question of what would you tell
Mm,
a good friend, a loved one? What would you tell a loved one in your position?
yeah, yeah,
And how can you give yourself that same compassion and advice? Yeah.
yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, I think I would just say self-compassion is so important when we're learning and growing. So and I feel that people who learn and grow together are stronger when we reach out to that community, when we have, as you mentioned earlier, a plan for support within the community. I think that's also important.
Yeah. Yeah. Great point. And, sometimes thinking about courage, aspects of courage are reaching out and asking for support and knowing you're not alone. Right. So how can we kind of, oh yeah, this is brave. Like what I'm doing is brave. I have a whole community of coaches also doing the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for this time. And
Yeah.
I can't wait to have you back for a third.
My goodness. I'll blush. I'm blushing. Thanks, Natalie.